Welcome to When Skills Matter, the podcast where we talk about all things skills related. Today, we're joined by Natal Dank, Executive Director and Principal Consultant at PXO Culture, author of Agile HR and Agile L&D, and one of HR Magazine's most influential thinkers. Natal's work has helped shape the global Agile HR movement, and she's known for creating evidence-based, people-centered strategies that help organizations adapt, perform, and grow. In this episode, we're exploring how agility builds skills and what it takes for HR and L&D to become the real drivers of adaptability and success. So, Natal, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. I want to start with your book, Agile L&D. Could you give us an overview of how it helps L&D practitioners to continuously upskill and reskill their workforce to align learning with business priorities?
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, which was very lovely, that I wrote Agile HR, and that was sort of looking at how HR can embrace business agility to deliver better results, but also the role of HR in building business agility across an organization and the people practices that you have to evolve. My history is that I came from an L&D background before I sort of embraced the whole of the HR remit. I sort of recognized that L&D play a particular role in that agile transformation. They also often have to lead by example, and they often have to upskill the rest of the organization in agility, but also more and more learning and development and organizational development as such a big part of the huge business challenges that we face. And I think we'll probably go on to that. So things like skills, things like AI innovation, things like reorganizing your teams to, innovate new products, deliver new value, all of that requires a very strong kind of expertise in L&D and OD. However, I saw that the kind of more traditional way of doing that, which is sort of more big programs, big bang release, often kind of designing everything up front and then releasing, large training programs or large leadership programs, just didn't fit the environment anymore. And that's what agility is all about. How do you adapt and respond and work much more incrementally with how you deliver value? So that was kind of the why I thought L&D needed its own book. Also, a lot of people in L&D don't recognize themselves as HR. So, I felt like we needed our own playbook. It also was a bit of an updating of my thinking. But the book centers around 5 key principles. The first is product led. So this is the idea of seeing the employee experience as your product that you deliver out across the organization, made up of different component parts. But crucially, products deliver value by solving problems. It's a great way to think much more about how you deliver value in an organization through what you do. Then human-centered design. So I talk a lot about design thinking and agile ways of working coming together to design great experiences. And then experimentation. Huge part of, how do you test, validate, and have the evidence that something works before you release. Then concept of T-shaped skills, which I think might be useful for this conversation. So working in multi-skilled teams to solve complex problems. And then, of course, deliver with impact. So this idea of how do you work much more evidence-based, much more value-driven in how you deliver your results. And that ultimately L&D is about lifting the performance of your organization. It's not just about designing great programs. So that's kind of why that book was, I thought, quite important, and also what sort of is set out in the book. Yeah.
Amazing. And how long did it take you to write the book? Presumably, it's a whole experience.
Well, you kind of lose your life for a good sort of 3 to 6 months, and then you sort of from there kind of moves more into the production. But I work with Kogan Page, who are a fantastic publisher, and I have an editor, and they keep you on track. And in many ways, you sort of, once you've got the core idea and the core kind of structure, then it is a bit incremental in that you do the first chapter, you submit that, you get feedback, and then you move on to the next one, and you sort of evolve your product, I suppose, as you're going along. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Things are permanently evolving, aren't they? So all your concepts are being tested and tried, and do you find that there are changes that you want to make or updates?
There is going to be another book, but I haven't fully committed the time yet, but it's developing. So I've been working with this idea of kind of workplace elasticity. So where it's sort of like the next evolution of agility in some ways. So I'm not sure how much you know about the agile kind of industry itself. So Agile comes from tech originally 20 years ago and was all about essentially about solving complex problems. So as the world becomes more complex, that more waterfall way of designing solutions where you plan everything up front and then sort of release everything, several months later, big bang style, doesn't fit the environment anymore because there's too much change, too many dependencies of any project or product. So Agile came about with this idea of how do you test and validate concepts and then features of a product as you build it up to make sure that you've got the evidence that it's going to work, but also that people are going to buy it, kind of thing. So that's then moved, as you know, into all kinds of industries. And we've seen whole new industries built upon this ethos of incremental development and iterative development. And of course, goes hand in hand with digitalization. So you've got that. But then in the background, there's this sort of industry of Agile itself. And in some ways, it became its own, I think, enemy in that there was big certifications that came out, big kind of models, some of these big scaled models where consultants would come in and say, right, your company should embrace this big rigid model of how to do Agile. And so there's been a bit of a rejection of that in business. And what you're seeing is sort of the evolution of business agility now being much more about your culture, your skill set, your values, and then a collection of tools that come from things like Scrum, Kanban, and other areas and sort of bring it all together. So, and less about this sort of licensed model. So that's kind of happened in the agility space. But I also think that the world has changed to such a point now where we used to talk about change in a way that kind of like, oh, we'll go back to some certainty. But now I talk about fundamental uncertainty. So we now live in an environment where you always will have to make a decision knowing something is about to change. And it's not because you don't have the data, it's because a change is about to happen and you don't know what it is yet. And it's going to impact your plan. And you can predict it, you can kind of maybe think of what it is, but ultimately something's going to give. So we now need to work in this state of fundamental uncertainty. And that brings forth a different way of doing agility, anti-fragility, this idea of how do you actually almost take advantage of crisis and change and sort of thrive in it. And so I'm playing with this term called workplace elasticity. It's like bending and stretching and coming back together again. How do you build that kind of organization? So, yeah.
I read an article the other day saying that 50% of people coming out of higher education are now using AI as an opportunity to start doing something for themselves. So does that affect businesses now and their HR responsibilities, do you think?
Oh, yeah, totally. And I think for some time, we've been talking more about the sort of the ecosystem of your organization as opposed to the kind of headcount report. I would say for at least the last 10 years, there is a growing kind of to be a successful business, you don't just have, permanent employees. You work with a range of contractors and freelancers. You work with a range of suppliers. And then more and more, there's evidence to show that groups of companies essentially work with each other to create advantage in the market. So, Google will work with other creative industries or other tech companies because there's an advantage of sort of sharing knowledge and helping each other. So this sort of co-competition kind of concept. And so you're seeing, so that concept of a network that's beyond your traditional organizational boundary is been a hot topic for a while. What is talent? What are skills? And that sort of no longer can you just see that as the permanent employee. There's even a lot of evidence to show that when someone leaves your organization, keeping them in the alumni, they call it now in HR circles, of keeping in contact because they go off, they have this great experience. And then if you could bring them back with that new experience, they can really add to your business because they'll hit the ground running quite well because they know your business, but also they've now got this added outside expertise. So yeah, definitely it really changes things. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking about skills, and do you think that, I was going to say, leaders struggle in making learning relevant and targeted because learning has changed so much over the last 20 years, looking at how things were all prescribed, and as you mentioned earlier, certification. And now we're looking at trying to identify what skills are so that we can, get more out of people. I mean, for example, at Skills Assess, our approach is to map skills gaps to roles and then recommend personalized training so that they get focused learning on what they need and build a learning where the gaps are. Do you think that there's a difficulty in trying to get the most out of people and identifying what their gaps are?
Yeah, look, I think that a lot of people, I would say a lot of teams and organizations don't necessarily start at the right starting point, which is what's the problem you're trying to solve. So there's one thing around saying we need our organization to have better digital skills or our people to have better digital skills, but for what purpose? And a lot of skills analysis and then targeted training around that needs to ultimately link back to what are you trying to achieve in the business, because the purpose behind that is either to build a new team that creates a new product or take advantage of a new part of the industry, or like what's happening now, understand how AI might enhance your product, or maybe how you could have a more productive process by bringing AI elements into your existing processes. So all of that is looking at, well, what's the skill sets for the work that you have to do, and then the work that you now want to achieve, and then look at the gap. So I use something called T-shape. So a T-shape model of, general capabilities that people have, and then one or a few deep specialisms. And then the idea of traffic light systems of, what do you have? Are you developing? What don't you have in terms of gaps? But then also overlay that increasingly with this concept of build, buy, borrow, bot. So what do you need to build? What do you need to buy? What do you need to borrow? And increase, bot now is not just automation, it's agentic AI, it's argumentation, it's basically what skills get replaced by tech in many ways. And that is moving so fast that there's a danger that people create quite heavy libraries and static systems and things like this. So again, I think the more that we can sort of have a process of how to do it, but think about why are you doing it? What's the problem to solve in the business? And then go and create, a way of working around that, a way of doing that skills analysis around that. And I think that's where we trip up, because we go and create these big skills programs off the back of it. That's not then linking into the business problem, the commercial strategy, the reason why the company needs that kind of skill. Yeah.
Yeah, and those programs also, the definition of agile means that you've got to be constantly changing. So if you build a whole
Yes.
program and then you find that, it's no longer agile and you've got to change it, it must be quite challenging.
Totally. And I think there was a big rush a couple of years ago to build skills inventories. That kind of thing is still needed. But again, what's the purpose of it? And how do you build it in a way that it can be easily updated, it evolves and it changes? We've had it with just AI. Even just a year ago, people thought they needed to learn prompt engineering, and essentially that doesn't exist anymore in the same way. So vibe coding was another one. The World Economic Forum, I think, says that within the next 5 years, I think it's like 40% of core skills are going to evolve or be out of date. That is super, super fast. And what you're seeing is a lot of the skills that you're needing more and more are things like critical thinking, being able to have a great conversation, influencing, these kind of things, because that's the learning agility that you need to pick up the technical skills. So, yeah.
So do you think that there's a risk that AI and digital skills are going to eclipse the human, or do you think the human is a vital part and that AI has got to be supporting?
Some people that follow me would know that I'm spending more and more time looking at this topic. And there's a couple of things. So one is I can talk about co-intelligence, which I've actually borrowed from someone called Ethan Mollick, who wrote a great book. And co-intelligence looks at how you work with AI as the human. What's the human collaborative relationship? And also, however, says that it's more than automation. It's about how do you partner with AI to essentially enhance the job that you do. But in that is a key role of a human. Also, as we start to look at agents coming into the workplace, particularly at the moment, an AI process is probabilistic. So this idea that it's based on probability, it's not deterministic. So as we know, it's not always right. And what we're needing to see is that you've got a human in the process to check the work. That throws up all kinds of interesting debates, doesn't it? So where do you put the human in the AI loop? I've been starting to use a term of the HR being the custodian of the human in the AI loop. What kind of skills does that person need? How do you maintain those skills? And if the process requires a human to check it, how do you maintain the skills if that person doesn't learn the job anymore? You know what I mean? So if AI is taking on the core aspects of that role, then how do you upskill the human to check the output in the future? It's okay now if that human's just come out of the process and looks after it, but going forward. And I think we've got a big debate about graduates now. What roles do they have? I was speaking to an organization where that's exactly what's happened. They've brought AI into some of their processes. They can see some great advantages, but some of the roles that they put graduates into have now disappeared. And they're actually at the moment looking at how do they change their graduate program to engage their graduates in different ways to upskill them about the job, because the job doesn't really exist anymore. It's fascinating. It's a bit scary. It's really vital that HR gets their head around it and partners with IT and operations and other areas to understand how do you do this effectively. And the person I spoke to was the head of L&D. L&D plays a huge role in this. Yeah.
How do all these organizations keep up with this change? I mean, it's happening faster than you can create the rules and the structure and the disciplines. I mean, it must be
Yes.
phenomenally difficult. So what do you find when you go out to consult with your clients? Do you find that
Yeah.
they're all different stages of adopting this?
Very much so. Yeah. It really varies. Like some people are literally nowhere near it because they don't have the money. So that's also an interesting space. And unfortunately, that is often, not for profits and kind of more service orientated, community orientated organizations. And then you'll go to the other extreme where you'll have large corporates with the money making huge bets in AI, but struggling to see how to bring it into production because of all these aspects to it. And then you've got this interesting tension where most people are using AI in a personal way now to help them, do things, get the job done, do personal things. But in an organization, there's a need to make sure it's safe. It's based on clean data. There's a sandpit environment that's kind of protecting the information going out into, limiting guardrails around how information is used and going into the training the model. That actually causes quite a delay in moving forward at the pace that the rest of the kind of the world is changing. So yes, tech is changing so fast. How do you keep up? But at the same time, the viable nature of bringing that tech into organizations and actually seeing the benefits of it is just simply can't be that fast. And so yeah, it's not one or the other, and that's complexity, I suppose, isn't it? Yeah.
But do you think we're sort of steaming and shooting forward into an era where we're going to have a lot more risk? Because, as you say, you either guardrail, you slow things down, you make sure everything's safe, or you can't really control everything because it's at everybody's fingertips now and everybody can work for themselves. I mean, I remember, it's embarrassing to say it, but going back to my early days in tech, the introduction of personal computers, and the mainframe guys didn't want personal computers to proliferate because they said they wanted to maintain control. And now we're in an era with AI where you
Yes.
can't stop people doing things. And so it's
Yeah, it
moving
was a
so
similar with
fast.
social media. Did a webinar this week where we hosted this debate, and in HR there was this huge thing about social media policy and a number of years ago. So people going onto social media and posting things about their work, and companies were frantically trying to catch up with, oh, how do we limit what people do and how do we control it? And then ultimately, what I think that taught us is that it's much less about having prescriptive rules and much more about a playbook. And that's the only way that you can approach, I think, this change is what's your playbook of kind of engagement? How do you approach this topic? What does this topic mean for your organization? What's the values that sit underneath it? And then you make iterative experiments and decisions. So at the moment, you might say, okay, well, we will bring AI into the organization in this way. We'll use it in these areas. However, this part, that seems too risky for us at the moment. But in 3 months' time, we will revisit that. So you need to have this sort of iterative rolling strategy. And you need to embrace that, I think, because there's no other way to really to evolve with it. I would say that it should be very multidisciplined, that transformation sort of team and decision. It shouldn't just be the head of IT or the head of HR or the head of, it should be a joint kind of combined decision process. And I think we need to be mindful of why you're doing it for your business, because I think that's what we've also seen. I did a post actually on LinkedIn this morning, and I didn't realize, but apparently in the US, AI investment is nearly 92% of GDP growth this year, that the top 10 stocks represents 40% of the S&P 500. And since November 2022, 90% of capital spending is gone into AI. This is a massive, you
Massive.
know, massive bet, isn't it? And at the moment, you're not seeing the return necessarily. For me, that's a rushing into the new shiny thing, which we always knew wasn't always a good idea. So, again, what's the business purpose? What's the problem you're solving? And then base how you're integrating AI around those things. And then if you make it very targeted experiments of the hypothesis, we think AI can help the product in this way, or we think it can deliver value like this, or we think it can make this process more productive. Okay, let's go and test it, get data, and then make a decision around it. And you can do that pretty quickly if you enable that kind of approach in your organization.
And you need the ranks of people to be checking and verifying and, as you say, controlling
Totally.
what's coming out. I mean,
Yeah.
quality
Yeah.
control becomes much more important.
It does. It does.
Yesterday, I was at this event where we had a presentation on agentic AI. The case study was a business setting up an entire business with agents, and one of the jobs was quality control by one of the agents. I'm not sure that fills me with 100% confidence.
Yeah, totally, totally. My partner is a techie, and we were debating even just today the kind of, okay, several years later, at the moment, the idea of the human checking the work of AI seems very reasonable, because we have been doing the work up until now. But going forward, does it become harder and harder to check that work if you don't know how it came about necessarily, or exactly that the quality control was done by AI? How do you know that AI is checking it correctly? Yeah. So it gets deeper and deeper. I suppose what I get a bit worried about is this. We say, oh, well, it's happening, we've got no control about that. We definitely do. We have choices, we have agency, and we should be much more mindful of the choices we're making around how we incorporate AI into our organizations. And I think now is the time to start having these proper discussions, and not about being fearful and saying AI is going to take our jobs. It's about talking about, the reality of our workplace and what does it look like as we start to bring it in, and how do we make good decisions about human worth, human skills, copyright law, ethics, and yeah, just have a much better discussion about it. I think there's a lot of hype around it. That's actually it's not beneficial, I think, for us.
No.
Yeah.
But do you think that peer pressure is actually also quite dangerous because people feel, well, everybody's telling us unless we get organized and start to use AI in a more serious fashion, we're going to be left behind. And in 3 years' time, you're going to recognize yourself.
And I think we've got to be mindful that there's a narrative coming out from companies that wanting to sell solutions that this must happen, that this is the future. But there's a profit motive behind that. And I think we've got to question some of the narratives that we're seeing in business circles. I was speaking this week in our webinar, someone asked a great question of how do you deal with C-suite that think that AI instantly works and is the answer? And again, well, why do they think that? It's because they want this magic, wand of instant, profit kind of thing. But actually reality is really different. And I think we now need to start to challenge some of these promises of $1 trillion revenue, and promises of replacing all this headcount and therefore saving money. But there's consequences to all of those as well. How do we become much more holistic in how we have this conversation rather than just believing the story, I suppose. Yeah.
I just want to pivot from this fascinating conversation to something else because we're very much involved in employability. So looking at people
Okay.
at the bottom end of the ranks, and the percentage statistics that are published every year say that 30% of the working population don't have digital skills. How do you think we're going to overcome this skills gap and get more knowledge into getting people more confidence, getting them trained to a level where they can be employed?
Yeah. But I think, again, it's about what are digital skills now? So we've got to unpack that a bit. I'm intrigued as to why someone would be deemed not employable based on digital skills. Because actually, what we're finding now is the learning agility of someone around the ability to pick up new technical skills, and adapt and use new tech in a working environment is actually the key here. And possibly that's what we're missing with that debate, and possibly missing with the hiring process as well. We do know that we've seen a shift in the hiring process around how do you look for much more transferable skills? How do you, seek skills out that weren't just from someone that did the job before? But I think that still controls a lot of the way that we hire. So I think there's something about we have to let go of this idea that someone does 5 years in a job and that gives you the skills to then go and do a job that's very similar. We actually need to be thinking about skills in new ways of how do people have the core, probably what we often call soft skills in the past, but core abilities and capabilities of learning new things, being able to critically analyze new things, pick up new tech, and then apply it in a new situation. Because then you can introduce digital in all kinds of situations and sort of decreasing the fear factor of, like, I have it a bit with AI. Oh, I should be using it, and there's a lot of new terms around it. So actually, how do we help people feel more confident in that environment of technology changing all the time, that it's actually okay, that's part of the experience, that's part of working. So I think there's more about how we could set up more robust education around being more adaptive in how you learn and then apply skills rather than it being a set skill criteria, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah. Have you read 100 Years Life
No, I haven't
by
read.
Linda Grattan? Yeah. So that's a really good one that looks at how each generation lives longer. And this older concept of school, work, retirement is, of course, no longer valid. And this is increasing now. So the idea that skills are going to be changing every 5 years, the ability to stay relevant in a working environment is really changing. And so how do you build education systems, but also working, organizations that help people continually update their knowledge
Yes.
and skills? Yeah.
Amazing. What makes you feel optimistic about the future of skills in this world? I mean, you mentioned digital skills. I suppose what I also meant to say when we were talking about pivoting and getting people into work is also, as you said, the soft skills, the critical thinking, the analyzing, and communication vitally. Do you think that we're on a path for skills improvement? It is actually percolating down through the ranks, or what's your feeling?
There's a big tension between how we traditionally run organizations, hire, skills develop, move people into roles, create teams, versus where we need to go if we're going to do this effectively, but also do this in a more human way. Just on the skills thing, there's a term at the moment called transversal skills. So this is the ability to move across different jobs, tasks, and situations. And it's cognitive, it's interpersonal, it's intrapersonal, it's digital, it's the idea of global citizenship. So actually, more and more, how do you set up environments where at school level, but also in organizations, people can be building these kind of skills, this ability to move around jobs, move into new projects and experiences, and adapt with the new tech that comes in and with the new opportunities. But that's a whole different mindset in how you approach not just L&D and skills development, but kind of the way you run a business. And I see this big tension between, we started talking about skills mapping at the start. And, I've spoken to several people lately where, oh, we do all this skills mapping and we're trying to be much more kind of agile in how we do that. But meanwhile, over here, we still have jobs, functions, career ladders, and reward systems that are based on much more of a rigid, kind of more traditional hierarchical structure. So we have these tensions in business at the moment. And I'm not totally sure, like, they're starting to evolve, but unless we let go of some of that more industrial mindset, I think we'll really struggle to be able to build more flexible, adaptable, nimble, networked organizations that are kind of needed now with this new environment. That's exciting, however, because if you get that kind of stuff right, that's great. And, building co-intelligence and all of that kind of is really, that can be super, super exciting. But I think we need to be mindful of what pulls us back and how senior leaders are often very much back in that old mindset, and then also how we just take care of humanity along the way and don't just make it about profit.
The words that come out on our discussion are agile, nimble, flexible, rethinking the past. I mean, it's an exciting time ahead. I really enjoyed talking to you about all of this, Natal. I hope we'll have lots more opportunities to chat. And I'd like to thank you very much for sharing those insights. And to all the listeners of this podcast, because I hope we'll have very many listeners, if you want to get a better idea on what skills matter most in your workforce, that's what we do, Skills Assess. We help organizations identify skills that drive performance, connect people with the right learning so that transformation lasts. And you can find more at www.skillsassess.ai/podcast, along with today's show notes. Thank you very much, Natal.
Thank you very much.